Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture. Bonjour, je suis Brent Fraser, vice-président, examen de médicaments. Bienvenue à la conférence d'aujourd'hui que j'aurai le plaisir d'animer. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I am a settler born in this land we call Canada, but with family roots far from here. I'm speaking to you from Belleville in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Canada's Drug Agency recognizes the inherent and treaty rights of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples across the lands. We are committed to moving forward in participation with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'd like to encourage you to think about where you live, work, and play, and acknowledge the people who lived here before you and cared for and sustained the land you call home. We've been presenting free lectures by prominent scholars and opinion leaders since 2014 to highlight key topics, discuss pressing issues facing health technology assessment and healthcare today. Our goal is to bring together diverse perspectives from Canada and around the world to spark dialogue, expand understanding, and inspire action. We'd like to invite the recipients, of our recognition awards to deliver a lecture, which is the case today. Today's talk, First Step in a Journey to Developing a National At-Risk Medication List, addresses a topic of growing urgency, drug shortages. As many of you know, shortages are a global issue, but their impacts are deeply felt here at home. They affect patients, providers, and the health system. In this lecture, we'll explore the importance of identifying and understanding medications at risk of shortage before a crisis hits. We'll hear about the case for a proactive, systematic, and transparent approach, one that considers both supply chain vulnerabilities and clinical risks. And we'll learn about early work being done to develop a national at-risk medication list, a foundational step that can inform future policy and strengthen Canada's pharmaceutical supply chain. Before I hand things over to Mina, a few quick logistics announcements. The recording of this session will be posted on our YouTube channel this week, should you wish to rewatch the session. We have intentionally reserved some time for Q&As after the talk, and please use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform at the bottom to enter your questions at any time. Additionally, we are offering simultaneous interpretation and live captioning in both official languages. Please use the link in the chat to access. The link will open up a new browser with the audio and captioning in your choice of English or French. If you have any trouble, please reach out to the CDA AMC events team in the chat and they will try to help. Our speaker probably doesn't need a lot of introduction to many of you today. He is Dr. Mina Tadrous, and he's the assistant professor at the University of Toronto. We are especially proud to welcome Dr. Tadrous today as he is the recipient of the 2024 Dr. Maurice McGregor Award from Canada's Drug Agency's 2024 Symposium. This award recognizes rising stars in the field of health technology assessment, individuals who show exceptional promise and leadership early in their careers, and the award celebrates the future of HTA in Canada. So Mina, I'll pass it over to you for your presentation.
Wonderful. And thank you, Brent, for the opportunity to be here. And thanks for CDA for hosting me to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. So thank you everyone for attending and taking time out of your busy days to be here. Before we jump in, I wanted to present some, personal disclosures and things that if you're upset with anything I say today, you can yell at me and not these folks. I have no current or past relationships with any commercial entities. Some of the work here and related to this topic, I have received funding or consulting fees from CPHA, CDA, Health Canada, Green Shield Canada, some honorarium from CSHP to speak on the topic, and there has been some grant funding from the US AHRQ. Um, my current work and some of the work here is under invention and patent review by the University of Toronto and the commercialization team there. So I will just note that, but nothing important that can't be figured out there. From a disclosure standpoint, some of the work here was supported whether through in-kind or financial support by CDA. We did receive a small catalyst grant from CHR and the University of Toronto. And like I mentioned, there is a patent review for some of the work here that's being held by Matrix Inc. And you'll understand why when we talk about the scalability of some of the work that we've been doing. So what I'm really hoping to do today is to talk to you a little bit about what is happening in the drug shortage space. What do you need to know about it in Canada? Describe how an at-risk medicine list fits more broadly into the framework and how we can tackle this. And really, I want to sell you on the framework and the way and lens that we think about this and why we think this is sort of should be the global example of how this is done. And then we want to provide an overview of ongoing developments in for a national at-risk medicine list. And I want to talk about some timely other issues that I want to plant the seed in your minds as you think about it. And like I mentioned in my disclosures, I think it's really important to thank the support and funding that we got to help us get to this point. So some of this work was funded by CHR, Catalyst grants from the University of Toronto, and some in-kind support that came from CDAs to be able to do some of the gathering of folks and bringing it together. So over the next 45 minutes, what I want to talk about is just to give you a brief background, talk about some of the past work we've done in drug shortages, but more dive into this at-risk medicine list. And I think if you leave with anything today, it's the framework of how we think about this and how could this be applied to other problems and situations that arise. We'll present some of the early evidence and environmental scans. We'll talk about the predictive model and then some emerging areas at the end. So this is what ChatGPT, when I describe to it the thinking of what I tackle when I think about drug shortages and drug problems. And frankly, this is my passion project. I've been lucky enough to work on a whole slew of different areas in HTA and drug policy, but this starts from my days as a pharmacist working in the hospital and seeing the shortages hit. And really, I think a lot of people don't quite understand why they happen, but I think what bothered me the most is that we felt very powerless about the situation. And the moment a shortage hits, most clinicians instantly are thinking about, okay, who's this going to affect? You have drugs that are going to be used in multiple different situations. What options can I switch to? What are the real consequences that are going to happen there? And we had very little to no evidence, and we still have very lacking evidence in what's actually happening in this space. And we've spent the better part of the last 8 years just trying to better understand and fill this gap. And in large part, a lot of it had to do with lack of access to data, but also this idea of how we view drugs. And not to kind of take a knock at the drug regulatory HDA system, but everything from the P&T committee at a hospital to Health Canada to CDR, everything, the machinery we have in the whole pharmaceutical policy sector is not built to tackle this problem. And what I mean by that is we're so used to we receive a single new drug. The drug receives approval. We may analyze it in the scope of its drug class, but every problem is on a singular drug, and then we put it on a formulary or we approve it or not. Now suddenly we have this problem where every single drug is at a risk of a shortage. Everything. So we have to start with things that have thousands. And we live in a time of plenty, a very blessed time where we have a real big problem where we have thousands and thousands of drugs to choose from, and this becomes the source of the problem. And really, I think understanding that why it makes it so challenging to work through some of this space is that we're drowning in information and making choices. One of the first things that every academic likes to do is we define our problem. And this area was largely driven by definitions of drug shortages that were varied in sense. But most cases for me, the most important thing to be thinking about is a drug shortage to me is when that patient comes into the pharmacy, am I able to fill that prescription? When they're on the bed in the hospital, are we able to administer that drug? And many times, Health Canada defines it as the inability for the supply to meet the demand of the drug. And why this is important, and if you leave with anything today, it's to recognize that sometimes a lot of the literature before we started tackling this was built on supply chain reports. And supply chain reports are great and all, they're early detection systems. But in many cases in the pharmacy, I would get a supply chain report where the CBC would cover something and a patient would walk in and they would say, I heard that this is on back order. I would go into my wholesaler website and I'd still be able to order it. And so the way we were even measuring things and talking about it wasn't the real problem. And this became a real issue because we couldn't even understand how big the problem is. Over the last decade, we've started to better understand it. So we know that from a CPHA survey that was done, 1 in 4 Canadians will experience, or someone that they love will experience, a drug shortage in the next 2 years. This number is probably so outdated after the children's Tylenol shortage that it's probably hard to meet somebody who doesn't know somebody who's been impacted by it in some way. In Canada, between 2015 and 2019, we had 2,000 shortages of drugs in some sort of way. And, there's been lots of shortage problems that have come up, but there's also been lots of policy solutions that allowed us to mitigate it. This is not just a Canada problem, right? So the FDA reports on this constantly. They have over 100 drugs in shortage, and Canada has 37 at the same time period. It also highlights that the problems and reasons, when you look at that figure on the right, can come from a variety of different factors, right? It can be everything from raw materials to loss of manufacturing, increased demand, discontinuation. And so you're kind of getting hit from all sides when trying to think through it. And it becomes challenging to know where is the problem starting and what things can be happening in this space. And again, just to reiterate, this is one of the biggest problems we've been facing in our healthcare system, and it seems to not be going away. Interestingly enough, when you look at data from 20 years ago, the number of shortages were not that high. But ever since we've started tracking it in 2017, this is a figure here showing the number of supply chain reports that go into drugshortages.ca. You can see here that it's a pretty steady pace of around a couple of hundred active reports every single month. Now, these are at the DIN level, so they're at the very specific level. And these may not mean that you can't order it. It just means that there's some sort of issue there that's happening, or an early flagging system. But to understand this, we first wanted to know what was going on. And so my colleague, Dr. Suda, who's at the University of Pittsburgh, and I wanted to simplify the supply chain. And I think this is a very quick crash course. And it's funny that I'm telling you right now, this is a simple version of what it looks like to get a drug. There's a really interesting paper that just came out that looked at clonazepam, I think it was, and it saw that it spread. And to get to Vancouver to be filled at a pharmacy, it had to go through 9 different countries. And to break that down a little bit, if you start at the far left of this figure, we have something called active pharmaceutical ingredients, so the powder that's in a drug. That can be produced in one country, then it has to be shipped to another place to make the FDF, the final dosage form, the capsule, the tablet, the cream. It's mixed with a whole bunch of other non-active ingredients and made there. And then it's repackaged. It's put into the labeling that has to come to Canada, that has to be in English and French, or the packaging that meets the FDA regulations or goes to whatever European country. And then all of that could be happening in 3 different countries. That's then shipped to a wholesaler. That wholesaler will then distribute it to the pharmacies, and then the pharmacy will dispense it and distribute it. Every single one of these arrows is a place that something can go wrong. And this is simplified because sometimes there could be multiple APIs, multiple finished dosage forms, repackaging and packaging that begins again. And there's hundreds of ingredients that could go into something. As it increases in complexity, you can think about the ingredients that go into manufacturing the API that support it. And this is a global scale that's happening around the world. And because of this, a variety of different factors can break down. And I want to highlight a few of them for you to give you a picture of things. One of the most common things that occurs is actually manufacturing problems, whether it's consolidation. And so one of the largest drug shortages that we've ever experienced happened in 2017, where we saw massive interruptions of um, injectable products. And it happened with injectable narcotics, canes, other different types of drugs. And it wasn't a hurricane or anything of that sort or geopolitics. It was actually 2 firms merging and trying to optimize their supply chains. And I want you to remember that because we're going to talk about later what happens when we mess around with supply chains. But these ended up being shortages of critical sterile injectable drugs around the world. And it really hit the US and Canada big time. And this was important to consider when thinking through it because there was nothing, this was sort of a mistake that could have been done better, or it wasn't something that we were caught off guard by. But there are situations when we could be caught off guard, and we start to see clues when things go wrong. A great example of that was Hurricane Maria. So Hurricane Maria devastated the island of Puerto Rico. And it was really horrible for the people of Puerto Rico. But little did we all realize that Puerto Rico is one of the largest producers of biologics and IVs in the entire world for a variety of different factors, things to do with taxes and incentives to be there. And when that happened, we saw massive biological shortages around the world. So, an island in one single place being caught off guard with a hurricane meant that the world didn't have biologic drugs. And as climate change and weather events increase, we probably need to anticipate that. Just 2 years ago, a tornado hit a Pfizer plant in North Carolina, and we had the same problem. They housed a lot of drugs that even in the US, it started to affect us being able to get things here. The other thing we start to realize is major recalls. So, as many of you know, part of good practice is that the regulators will send and test drugs. So, they'll send people to the manufacturing sites, and sometimes this leads to shortages because they shut down manufacturing sites around the world or there's issues with them. They also will test batches. And in 2018 and 2019, there was a number of manufacturers that had issues with nitrosamine, which is a byproduct of them producing these drugs. And we saw it with valsartan and ranitidine. And I really, and I will publicly admit this, put my foot in my mouth, I remember with this one. And it taught us an important lesson about the transparency in the supply chain. I received a call that asked, there's a few reports coming in about valsartan. Are you worried? And I said, "Nah, worried? No, we have like 12 different generic versions of valsartan. Where could anything go wrong?" Little did we realize that about two-thirds of the manufacturers were all getting their API, remember that beginning powder, from the same place. So although they were all labeled differently, produced in a different factory for the final dosage form, their API was coming from the same factory in China. And so that meant that that's where the problem was. So all of those products got recalled, and it ended up being a global problem around the world. And so even though we think we have a number of products, we may have more vulnerability in our supply chain than we realize. And it's these situations that highlight that for us as we work through it and think about what's happening. And you can see from all of this that the supply chain is concentrated, it's interconnected, and most importantly, it's global. It sits across different countries. We are highly dependent on other countries to produce our own drugs. Different estimates will say, depending on how you want to measure this, and we don't exactly know how much Canada produces in itself, that, we probably receive 80% of all of our drugs from external factors. But our domestic production is there. It's better than some countries, but it's not as good as most. And even the big producers, China and India, still depend on other countries to also produce theirs. So no one is safe from any of this. And so I think we have to be thinking more global when thinking about this. The last thing that I want to highlight for you when thinking about reasons and things that we need to be accounting for to set up some of the work we're doing is that we need to think about humans and system nature. And we got a really neat lesson of this during the pandemic, not to bring back any trauma for everybody. But if you guys remember, we had this pandemic a few years ago. And what we did during that time is we tracked drugs utilization because we wanted to see if there was any shortages that happened. And we saw some interesting things. The first was that any policy that you do will instantly impact your supply chain. So the one policy that a lot of provinces started doing is they limited the amount of supply. So in many provinces, when you go, if you're a public beneficiary, and private insurance does this too, you could get up to 100 days. And the reason for this is we want to spend less on dispensing fees. But because we wanted to stretch out our supply, we started asking people to take less, so 30 to 60 days of that supply. What that meant is we saw a spike in the volume that was actually happening in the space. And so when that spike happened, our policy impacted the supply chain. So that means in the future, anything we do, we need to monitor it to realize that policies do work, whether in the intended or the unintended consequences. And it's important to consider what that means. The second is that news impacts people. You guys might remember a drug called hydroxychloroquine, which was touted as a potential curative agent for COVID-19. When the tweets came out about the potential for this, we saw massive blips right at the time of the pandemic, and it continued to rise afterwards as a lot of misinformation came out about the drug. This is sort of the classic toilet paper syndrome. People were worried that this was going to impact it. And so the news hits that. We did an analysis where we looked at whether you think tweets or meta-analyses publications would impact hydroxychloroquine use more. You can kind of predict which one was the bigger impact. And let's just say that evidence isn't always the leading factor when it comes to that. And the last thing is it's not just people, right? It's also systems and organizations. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, if you remember, we were worried about its respiratory effects. And hospitals started to switch to salbutamol or local inhalers rather than using nebulized forms. In response to this, the public started rushing to get their inhalers, worried that they wouldn't be able to get their hands on it. And so, as organizations stockpiled, people stockpiled, what ended up happening is we triggered a shortage. So much so that Health Canada actually had to import inhalers from other countries just to meet the demand that was happening in Canada. And so, all of this to say that it's not just about hurricanes and manufacturing and recalls, but also how we respond to policies and how we do this. But so what? Do these shortages actually matter and do they make a difference? And they do. Where they affect things is they can have clinical consequences, they can have system consequences, and they can have costs. But not every shortage is created equal. And this is an important nuance that we can't react or think about every shortage in the same way. Let me paint you a picture here. One, some shortages can be really worse outcomes for patients. There was a really great paper in JAMA that looked at the drug shortage impact of a norepinephrine shortage. So the hospitals that had norepinephrine had a shortage of norepinephrine had to switch to phenylephrine. And when they did that, what happened is they saw an increase in mortality and they saw an increase in cost because of this mortality and extended hospitalization. This is a shortage that killed people. On the other hand, that recall of valsartan I was talking about was studied in a variety of different ways. And what I'm showing here is a paper that nicely explored this impact in Ontario. And you can see in the upper part of this, the orange line, the huge drop in valsartan from the recalled products and the rise of other products. People were switching. But we only saw a 0.05 increase in emergency room department visits. And my colleagues and I have studied this in Canada, in the US, and there's no impact on health outcomes long term, but there are impacts on the health system. So this illustrates that some drugs can cause really bad clinical consequences, and others can have system impacts, even though they may not affect consequences. And it all depends on what the drug does, what it's used for. Is it preventative or curative? Is it acute or not? And you could start imagining now that not every shortage hits the same. But I don't want to downplay the impacts on a health system. So we did this paper here where we looked at the valsartan uptake right when that recall happened. And we estimate anywhere between 160,000 to 200,000 Canadians had to switch valsartan in a single week. That's 200,000 faxes, unfortunately, flying around, doctor's visits, emergency room visits, as patients grappled with what to do and what to do next. This is, on an already stretched healthcare system, unnecessary and could be improved in a variety of different ways if we improve the way that we respond to shortages. And the last is this unintended consequences. My colleagues in Ontario looked at, after the children's Tylenol shortage, they looked at poison control calls as people started to try to make Tylenol at home for their kids. And the compounding handcuffs that were around pharmacists' hands meant that people were driven to try to make it on their own. And when this happened, you saw a massive spike in calls to the emergency room and the poison control center as people tried to figure it out themselves. So what can be done? So I've shown you that there's consequences to these. And around the world, there's been a lot of interesting policies that have been proposed. We can do things like develop domestic production, we can friendshore, we can start developing bulk, we can hold buffer stock, we can have strategic stockpiles, we can have reactive and proactive policies. But the problem is, and what this all boils down to is what I was mentioning in the very beginning, we can't afford to do this for everything. We can't bulk purchase all drugs. Even the United States, as much as this sounds crazy, couldn't produce all of its own drugs, right? A plant to build drugs can cost anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion. Multiply that by the thousands of drugs you have to produce and your drug consumption. It's not logical to be able to do that. And so you have to come up with policies in that way. And you have to do it for some drugs or another. So where this points people to is how do we select which drugs we're going to do this with? And this, you know where this is going, lists. So the list of drugs that happen there are very important. And we've seen a number of lists associated with drug shortages. Australia produced a list of all drugs below a certain cost, and they raised their price. France looked at 450 drugs that had shortages, and they select 50 of them. Canada started to produce a tier 3 drug shortages list during the pandemic. And the WHO and the FDA have the essential medicines lists. And this is where I'm going to soapbox. The problem with lists is the way we make them. What do we do and what do we put into them? And in a lot of times, the way that we've classically done this, and not to point fingers at anybody, is we bring a bunch of experts into a room and then we select the drugs out. And the joke I make is that if you happen to have a dermatologist in that room, not to pick on dermatologists, but I guarantee you no one's going to leave that room without having a cream on that list because everyone wants to have their opinion taken. And it becomes challenging on how do we produce these lists in a way that makes sense and how do we do it in a systematic way. And that's why we launched our project, which is developing an evidence-based informed list. And I want to sell you on some things that are the cornerstone to how we think about this. And I hope the evidence that I've taken the time to talk about here build through this. The first is to build a list, it has to be systematic. You have to be able to take into account the thousands of drugs so that you don't miss any, so that you think about them thoroughly and equally, and that you're not influenced by bias. And the only way to eliminate bias is to be systematic. The second thing is you have to be adaptive. You have to be adaptive to the policy situation, to your current local context, and what you're able to do. The third is to build trust. It has to be transparent, and the methods in which you use them have to be known. And the fourth is updatable. The moment you create a list, it's instantly out of date because the policies that you do have updated the future. Just like how that policy of doing 60 days or 30 days of supply affected the drug utilization, or if you change the number of manufacturers in your country, things change and updating them is essential. And the most important is that if you're going to pick drugs from a shortages and risk medicine list, you have to take into account two things. One, you have to take into account that not every drug has the same risk of a shortage, and you have to take into account the supply chain risk. And the second is not every drug is as clinically important as the next. All drugs are sort of important, but some drugs are very important in acute settings and others are not. Some have therapeutic options, and you can imagine we can measure and understand the clinical risk of all of them. And if we do this systematically, we can then percolate to the top the drugs we care about most. So you can imagine if we were creating a stockpile, I would want Canada to stockpile or think about norepinephrine versus valsartan. And I just showed you the examples of why. One is clinically detrimental if I don't have it. The other one, I have options. And we can start to think through that. And the last thing is anything we produce has to be policy agnostic to be beneficial to the ecosystem. Everyone has different lenses, the PNTs, the CDA, Health Canada, manufacturers, everyone has a different lens. And for it to be useful, it has to be adaptive in that sort of way. And that's what we worked out and tried to do. So to develop the list, what we did is we worked in three phases. The first phase is we looked at evidence development. The second, we brought experts together from a variety of different areas, including wholesalers, manufacturers, PNTs, clinicians, and we brought them all together. And we didn't ask them what drugs to put on the list. We asked them, does this framework make sense? And the things that we're using to produce this list. And then the last is we posted it publicly and we got insight from a variety of different folks. So again, our framework is that we want to give every single drug in Canada a supply chain risk score and a clinical risk score. And our supply chain risk has a variety of different factors in it. And the way to think about this is like a cardiovascular risk score. I can't predict that someone is going to have a heart attack, but I can tell you who has a higher likelihood of it. But that person can have a ton of risk scores and still, family history, smoke, have all the, comorbidities, and still they may never have a heart attack. And a person who doesn't have any of that may still have one. But if you had to select it based on probability, this is what you would do. And it's never 100%, but you can get closer. And the next is we needed to give every drug a clinical risk. You can imagine that drugs at the top would be life-saving, below them would be drugs that have subtherapeutic options, and then all the way at the bottom where there's some drugs, and this is controversial, but if they went on shortage, it might be okay. And then we can actually select through them, and then what would percolate to the top are drugs with the highest risk and drugs with the most clinical importance. And that's what we were trying to do. So let's talk about phase one. So what we did is we briefly did 3 different environmental scans and we developed a predictive model. So let's talk about the environmental scans. We did 3 of them. The first was to better understand the clinical variance that goes into harms, and this was led by CDA. The second is we looked at drug utilization, so we better understood how much impact there was on drug utilization. This was led by my team at the University of Toronto. And then we tried to find if there was something we can understand and learn from related to clinical importance and rating scales. So what did we find? And really briefly, When we looked at environmental scans of harms, we found very few studies, only 22 randomized studies and one scoping review. But what was interesting is it varied across a whole bunch of areas. So anesthetics, oncology drugs, vaccines, COVID treatments, and people tried to measure it in a variety of different ways. Mortality, hospital, ED visits. But mostly what we actually found is that the most important factor was that if they reported any safe alternatives. If there was a safe alternative, the impact was always less. So we knew that therapeutic alternative became a very important measure for us in a variety of different ways. What we also saw is that not every shortage had harms in the same way. Some increased healthcare utilization, but very few were able to actually affect mortality and hospitalization. It was a bit beneficial, but again, a small number of studies across a varied wide area. The next thing we looked at was drug utilization, and this was to inform our predictive model. We were able to find 41 retrospective observational studies. 8 of them were conducted in Canada, and 24 were from the US, so largely North American type studies. And they studied things like ARBs, antibiotics, opioids, and anesthetics. They used prescription data, hospital data, you name it, they tried to use it. But the most interesting thing to me was that there was so much variance. And sometimes these shortages would happen, then they would have as little as a 0.29% reduction, all the way to having a 99% reduction. And so it meant that just because there's a shortage doesn't mean it instantly hits. It's important to also recognize that very few shortages get to zero because many times we have other supply or things get trickled in, and the response by policymakers and decision makers in hospital systems is able to mitigate them in some sort of way. And the last and most exciting is we looked at the clinical decision tools, and we were able to leverage things from the HTA world that had looked at measurements of how we can actually score things systematically to look at their clinical scores. And we were able to then use one of these tools, adapt it in a different way, change some of the scoring, and then validate it within our own context of just looking at clinical importance. So keep in mind in the HTA world, a lot of these tools have things like pricing, cost effectiveness. We removed all of that and just looked at them this way. And so what were we actually able to pull? So when we decided to land on our final clinical decision tool, it had 9 different categories. The first that we asked all clinicians was, 1, how severe is this disease that it's treating? The second is, what's the size of the population that it treats? The third was, is it mentioned in clinical guidelines and how important is it? The fourth was comparator interventions. Is there anything better than it, or is there an unmet need? Then we looked at efficacy and safety. Does it compare to everything? Does it have valuable efficacy and safety? Does it improve patient-reported outcomes? What type of medical service is it? Is it curative, being the highest score? And then the last was, does it serve a public health interest? Does it, vaccines, antibiotics, antivirals would fall into that category. And what we did was kind of neat. What we then took is we took that list and it had every one of those scores has a weighting, and no one knows the weighting. And the clinicians would then go and they would get a random selection of 250 drugs that were most associated with their clinical area, and they would be able to score those drugs independently. We would then get 2 to 3 clinicians to review it for each drug. And if there was a high level of disagreement, we would then roll and get more clinicians. The most number of clinicians we needed to get some sort of level of agreement that was acceptable was about 6 clinicians. We did this for every single drug at the drug and formulation level. We selected stakeholders and clinicians that were both pharmacists and physicians, and we selected people from a variety of different inpatient, outpatient settings, hospital locations, and specialty. And we got everyone to score those drugs. And if they didn't know the drug, they didn't name it, like they didn't score it. What was important is that we sent everyone about 200 to 250. The most any clinicians could score was actually 100 drugs or so. So most clinicians were only able to score what they were able to use or what they actually know how to use in that space. This became very challenging in very specialized areas, and we can talk about some of the lessons learned there. The last part I wanted to talk about was the actual predictive model. So the predictive model was built so that we can better understand real-world drug utilization trends in response. So what we did is we conducted a population-based cross-sectional time series. We used a variety of different data sources. We actually had to end up merging 10 different data sources to be able to build this study out. And we used IQVIA's MIDAS data to better obtain monthly wholesale purchasing from January 2017 all the way to December 2021. And our outcome definition was a 33% decrease in drug supply. So let me explain how this works. We basically look at the average utilization and we take a 6-month average, and then we look at the index date, which is when a supply chain report happens. And then we look to see a 33% drop. That is defined as a shortage. The reason we landed on a 33% drop is because when we did some validation studies, what we found is that for anyone who looks at drug utilization all the time, it's very normal between months to have a fluctuation of about 5 to 10%. So if you don't do this, what you do is you get a lot of false positives. You get a lot of drugs that look like they're being affected, but it's really just the month is shorter, it's seasonal effects. And so the 33% drop gets us to above an 85% specificity. And so that's the level that we wanted to be at when we conducted our study. So what we did is we found drugs that had a supply chain issue. We matched them with equivalent drugs 4-to-1 that did not. We then ran it through the multivariable analysis. We examined the trends in drug utilization to see if the shortage happened or not. And then we determined the association between all the different products that are in there, and we developed a predictive score. We then took that scoring and we scored every drug in Canada based on the characteristics of the score. And here's the characteristics that we looked at. We looked at everything like what's the main indication or the ATC classification. We looked at the formulation. We looked at the unit price, the age of the drug, how old is it since its approval, the number of manufacturers active in Canada, the market size, is it an essential medicine list, does it have a therapeutic alternative, the number of active ingredients in it, the number of DINs approved in Canada, the numbers of DINs covered by public payers. We looked at the schedule of the drug, provider administered, was it a tier 3, was it brand? And then we also created other variables like market concentration, has it had a previous drug shortage? And we built all of this into the model. And here's what we found. We found that 1 in 10 drugs that had a supply chain issue actually had a shortage. And this really resonated with me because 9 out of 10 times when we have a supply chain issue, the system is able to absorb it and it doesn't affect the drugs in that way. And so this is important to recognize because this is a deep departure from all the literature we've had in the past, which was largely built on supply chain reports. And then we were actually able to build a predictive model that was able to help us understand which drugs had the highest likelihood of having a shortage in the next year. So what then we're able to do is we can give every drug a score for a supply chain risk and a clinical risk and feed it through this framework and be able to categorize them in some sort of way. So you can imagine drug B, which has a 70% chance of having a probability of a risk, which is substantially higher than the other ones, and is clinically more important, would be the one that percolates to the top. So again, we're trying to pick out the drugs that are clinically important and have the highest supply chain risk. This is how well this predictive model did. So when we looked at the 2 years after our model was built, we looked at those that were categorized as high risk, caution, and others. What we found is that our high risk group, in the next 2 years, almost 20% of them had a shortage. In contrast, the other group, only 6.3% had a shortage. So by being able to select this, you were 300 times more likely to pick the right drug or which drugs you should be aiming for by looking at the higher risk. When we look at this visually, you can sort of see it here. You have the actual in blue, the actual number of shortages versus the predicted number. And in contrast, the other group, the predicted number is substantially higher than the actual shortages there. And so what this means is that if you're going to actually pick out which ones you want, our predictive model, which is still being improved upon and built out, helps you get in the right direction of picking the right drugs. And this tool was built and co-hosted with a lot of the experts like we talked about it. But really what most exciting for us was that on December 28th, 2024, Health Canada released and proposed regulations for addressing and mitigating the harm to shortages. They released a draft critical and vulnerable drug list, which I think they've collected feedback for and are reviewing currently. And what they were able to do is use our list to help them calibrate some of their thinking. They looked at drugs with the highest clinical importance. They then took that list and compared it to international jurisdictions. And then lastly, they looked at the supply chain risk score that we had built. And what this helped them do is better understand which drugs they were able to select out to make a short list of what would be on the future critical and vulnerable drug list. And what we were also able to do is produce this sort of imagery or this dashboard that we posted publicly for a bit of time. And what this allows people to do is go into it and be able to look at which drugs are at the highest risk. And so you can pick out which drugs you want to explore. You can explore them by drug name, formulation, and ATC. And what this really is exciting is that not everyone is going to look at it the same way for the exact same policy, but you can imagine that you can actually play around with it depending on what you want. And what we're working towards at the University of Toronto is building a more robust type of analysis where we can look at not just helping people predict shortages, but respond to them through communication. We're building AI tools and we're building things like supply matchmakers that can help do that. And the impacts have been, in a very short period of time, pretty interesting. Regulators, like I pointed out, have used them in a variety of different ways to think about some of the policies. Wholesalers have been implementing it and using it in their procurement strategies for hospitals. So when they're thinking about which drugs they need to have redundancy for, they can look at which drugs have the highest risk of shortage and are clinically important. Hospital managers, when they're doing their local procurement or looking to reduce negative effects, can be using this. And pharmaceutical companies can be looking at which drugs have the highest risk to help them bring new drugs to Canada. Even we've worked with some of the new manufacturers that are looking at public-private partnerships that are exploring which drugs would help the system in Canada to be able to do so. And by picking these drugs, they're able to pinpoint where they might get the most bang for their buck in the way of which way they do this. And the last thing related to this work is that these tools have to be updated. And this is the challenge we have now is how do we scale this? Like I said, it has to be adaptive and updatable. We're going to constantly have to have clinical reviewers. We're developing AI tools that help us score the drugs to flag which drugs need new scores, and we're going to randomly select more and more drugs. We envision that the updated tool will have to be updated monthly. The predictive model will have to be calibrated annually, and the drugs will have to be scored every 2 to 3 years to keep up with clinical changes in this world. In the last 4 minutes here, I just wanted to talk about some important emerging areas and some food for thought as I leave you with this. The first is we've hinted towards this, but I think it's important for us as Canadians to think about how do we think globally and act locally. I think in the beginning of the presentation, I sold you on this is a global issue, but we know that everyone acts independently. And the proof was during the pandemic. My colleagues and I at the University of Pittsburgh, we looked at this type of analysis of what happened with purchasing when the pandemic hits. And this is global purchasing from 69 countries aggregated together. And you can kind of see here, the biggest variation is really the length of the month that affects it until you get to the very far right here in March 2020. And you can see massive blips of bulk purchasing by drugs as they try to get ahead of the curve. And no country was pure of this. Every country tried to do it, some more than others. And the reason for this is we actually don't have anything that says that countries can't do this. And as many countries start to create buffer stocks and start to add more drugs to their systems, and we try to hoard things as countries are putting tariffs on each other, this is only going to get worse. And I think that this is going to precipitate more and more shortages. And it's really important to consider how we play nicely together. The other thing is the shortages are global. And when they hit everybody. This is the valsartan shortage that I've talked quite a bit about in this presentation. We've used it as an example in a number of our studies. And what you see here in the green line is that the global purchasing drops right when the recall happens. But when you break it down by developed economies and developing economies, what you can see here is that the drop mostly is driven by developed countries and stays pretty flat. And actually, when you look at some developing economies, their purchasing doubled in the month that the recall happened, which indicates that they were probably dumping drugs that were recalled in some countries in poorer countries. And I think how we interact with each other is going to be important when we want to be good global citizens. And when the same shortage hits different countries, they don't hit the same way. And the biggest predictor of how bad it's going to hit you is your GDP. And we did this across oncology products, antibiotics, and antihypertensives with global shortages. These are shortages that hit at least 20 or more countries. And it doesn't matter what you do, the GDP becomes the biggest factor. And I think if we want to be collegial around countries, we need to be starting to think about this, which sets up the biggest elephant in the room, tariffs. And we've spent the last few months thinking strongly through this. And so we know that there's currently these drugs are being reviewed by the US federal government through some sort of policy issue. And we can have a conversation that we're done when I'm done this presentation. But I think the thing I want to draw from all of this is that we as Canadians shouldn't be taking for granted our supply chains. We should be thinking about their resiliency We should be thinking about nearshoring, friendshoring, and domestic production. Everything should be on the table. But I think most concerning is to think that these global shortages and global problems won't be affected by the tariffs. My biggest concern is that as companies try to move things around too quickly and we try to respond to every single tweet or post that comes out of the Oval Office, we may misreact or overreact to some of them. So I'd rather us be thinking with clear minds about where our potential problems are. We need to pinpoint which drugs we're most worried about, and we need to start acting now before things shift. Importantly, we don't know where these things are going to go, and if, every few months they're called back. But I do think that we need to recognize that as companies try to move things around, there is a risk to our supply chains. And so I don't want us to keep waiting till it's too late to be able to action them. And I think it's important to kind of talk about what this looks like. And it's not just the United States. I think geopolitics is going to be a broader issue as we enter this current turbulent time. We saw during the pandemic when hydroxychloroquine was touted as a potential drug that India canceled exports of those drugs. If we get into trade wars with other countries, are they going to not export or import some of our products? And so I think we need to be thinking about where our vulnerabilities are and being more surgical in the way that we attack this problem and think through it. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here and share some of our work. I think it's an exciting time to be thinking about supply chain resiliency and wanting to work on this. And I'd like to turn to Brent and Nicole and have a conversation about this. But thank you again for the opportunity to be here and share some of our work.
Thanks, Mina. It's been a great overview. And I think, in particular, for me, it's just reiterating the global impacts that can happen on drug shortages and that we can prepare for all these shortages. And there's a lot of activity that happens within Canada trying to mitigate shortages. But all you need is a hurricane in one jurisdiction that could potentially wipe out all of that planning within this group. We do have some questions that have come in both the Q&A tab as well as the chat function. You did mention earlier that you didn't factor price, but one of the questions was whether or not, particularly for older drugs, that as the cost of goods increase, that if they're locked in pricing either through a negotiated listing agreement or through the PCPA pricing rules for generic drugs, do these restrictive policies potentially mitigate or increase the risk for shortages, do you think?
So it's a big question.
Yeah.
I think when I first entered this space a number of years ago, there was a lot of debate about is it price, and I think some folks just want to boil it down to price and say that it's just the price. And I think that's a very simplistic view of what happens. And let me paint the picture for you. If you have two different drugs and one has a very big market size, say you're looking at a statin or a very big market size, and then you have another drug that has a very small market size, those are actually bigger predictors of what's going to happen with not just shortages, but also the cost and the profitability of that drug. A company is willing to take tighter margins for a bigger market size because their fixed costs are spread out over a larger number of drugs, and they're able to kind of look at them as a broader issue. We also know that companies that have broader portfolios are willing to have more dynamic pricing when it looks at it. What we found in our models is that when we played with price, we had to account for things like formulation, market size, rarity, and the number of manufacturers in the product. And that really determines it. So to just boil it down and say a dollar is too much or too little is a little bit too simplistic of it. So to me, price is a potential policy lever. And this is the way I look at it. If we know a drug has a potentially high risk of shortage, it's clinically important to us, and we only have one manufacturer, then we can use price to draw people in or at least revisit that drug because it's very important. I prefer as a taxpayer that we're more surgical, that we think exactly about which products we want to bring to the market and use that. Jumping from one manufacturer to two to four manufacturers decreases our probability of a shortage relatively from 20 to 30%, depending on which formulation it is. So those are the kinds of products we could be thinking about. So to me, it's not about just price as like a standstill, like it's 50 cents, it's too little, it's too much. I think we have to account for market size, we have to account for those number of factors, and we can use it again as a lever for us to draw people in for drugs that we care about. So what I'm hoping is that we start thinking about more proactive things, and as payers and as PCPA and as the Health Canada folks sit back and they digest a lot of this information, I think it's thinking about how we can be more proactive instead of always anticipating people to submit paperwork to us. That would be the massive shift. And I think then we can use price as a lever to be able to draw people in.
Great, thanks. There is one comment that individual has made about the fact that sometimes it's easier to get through the regulatory requirements to address the shortage as opposed to the reimbursement requirements
Yes.
that individual jurisdictions and or private insurers may have in response to a shortage. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think just more broadly, we have some policies that are what I would consider proactive and some are reactive, right? So the proactive policies like buffer stocks and developing manufacturing are trying to mitigate the future potential of a risk. That's one bucket of things to be thinking about. The other bucket that we could probably get a bit better at, but we is thinking about reactive policies. When a shortage hits, what can we trigger that allows that? And the silver lining was during the pandemic is we had some of these importation, thinking through the multi task forces that we had that brought people together, helped us respond better. And I will say, I don't think this got a lot of attention, but we did a paper that was actually in JAMA that compared Canadian to US impacts of the same shortage. So the same shortage hits Canada or the US, and we looked at which one did better. Canada responded 40% better. This is something that we were in a period where we were self-hating, I say. We were in our self-hate period. Um, and it's something to be proud of. And one of the reasons we were able to do that is we were able to respond faster. We brought all the stakeholders to the table, and I got to give kudos to Health Canada for being able to lead that. And is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But I think it's that kind of working together and being responsive that helps make sure that we do that in the right place. Now, there is still the challenge of you get through the regulator and then you got to get listed on the public payers to be the switched over product. Could we improve how fast we do that? Could we improve empowering pharmacists to compound faster like they do in the US for some products in certain situations? Yes. And I think there's still some room for growth here, but I think we're all going in the right direction.
Great. We had a question about how far in advance does your predictive model actually predict a shortage?
It's built on a 1 year outlook of a shortage happening in the next year.
Okay, great, thanks. Sorry, I'm just kind of going through all the
Yeah, we're catching
questions.
up
Some
on questions.
some of them are very product specific, so I'm not sure if we can answer
And
those
again,
questions.
I'm happy to answer questions if people send me emails if they're very product specific. Yeah.
Okay, and some of these it may be best to contact Health Canada because they're often mitigating or managing some of the risks that come through. Um, Can you maybe comment, like I know the European Union has also developed a critical list as well, and it seems like other jurisdictions might be going in that direction as well. Is there a way for, internationally people to work cooperatively to help develop these lists, or are the systems just too diverse that it would make it challenging or not very effective to develop kind of one global vulnerability list?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I think there's opportunities for shared learning about how people do this. I will say that I think the way that we've tackled it learned from other people's mistakes. So we kind of came to the party a little bit later. And what we saw is the way that they look at it, they don't take into account both factors. So they will often take drugs that they think are most clinically important, or they only look in a subset of drugs that have had shortages, and it becomes challenging for them to do that. It is important to consider what drugs you have on your formulary. Like, just comparing between Canada and the US has over 1,000 different products that we don't have. And it's different formulations, different redundancies, different combinations. So I think as much as you want to learn and share, the list in the end of the day has to be based on your current utilization and your current marketplace. A manufacturer that knows that Canada loves IV pantoprazole, which is this if any hospital pharmacists are in here that was on shortage and gave a lot of people a lot of heartburn. Then you may want to enter the marketplace knowing what's available in that country. And so I think it's challenging to say let's copy paste, but I do think there's an opportunity for shared learnings, for working together to kind of look at that and establishing international standards. The one place I do think that we should be working together is if we do start stockpiling or building buffer stocks, if we all do it at the same time, we're going to run into a COVID problem again where we trigger
Yeah.
shortages. So we should be talking to each other about our coordination so we all don't try to buy norepinephrine at the exact same time and trigger shortages. So I'm a bit worried about that from the international place. And I think that's where we should be talking and learning. And frankly, as everyone does different policies, I'd like to see which ones are most cost effective, which ones seem to work the best, and which ones don't work, so we don't all keep doing the same mistakes and we start working towards what works better, because we do have a bunch of natural experiments that are going to be happening around the world as different policies are rolled out.
Great. Thank you. Unfortunately, I think we're at time right now, and we're going to have to wrap up the Q&A session. There were definitely a lot of comments and questions that were quite important, so I apologize for having to close off the session. But before we go, Mina, do you want to kind of identify for you what you think the most important takeaway message is from your lecture today?
So I think for people that, thank you again for joining and the opportunity here. I think there's probably two major lessons that I'd want to take away. One, I think that we're doing great work in Canada and it's starting to get better and better. But the only way that this works, and this is probably a lesson across so many files, is that by bringing people together that come from different factors, and this tool would not have been possible if we didn't bring the wholesalers, the advocacy groups, and all those folks to the table. And they were super engaged. And those types of tables is where good things happen. And I know CDA knows this, and a lot of people at the table know this, but that was a really important insight for us as we built into a new area that typically, as a pharmaceutical policy guy or an HTA guy, we didn't really ever touch. The second part is that I think that the big Canadian thing here is as we're using this crisis to try to solve things, is we need to be surgical. We can use data, we can use evidence instead of doing broad swaths of bad policy where we spend money on a whole bunch of drugs. We can pinpoint which ones we want to action. We can be nimble, we can be responsive, and that takes sort of an investment in data and research. But once we do that, we can do that in a very quick and nimble way, and it'll be much more cost effective and adaptive.
Great. Thank you very much, Mina. I think it'll be very important as we talk about drug shortages to look at, as you mentioned at the very end, some of the economic, geopolitical issues that are happening and what the impact can be on this particular issue, particularly as personally, I think a lot of the tariffs are going to affect the generic manufacturers as well as some of the contracting manufacturers. And I think coming up in some of the Q's and A's, it was identified that the generic industry is particularly at risk for shortages. And so that's something I think we can probably look at a bit further in the future. So again, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise. I think based on the comments, you can see that there have been a lot of kudos and people find this information quite valuable to themselves. And also, I want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in to today's lecture. There will be a short evaluation survey that will pop up in a new window when you exit Zoom, and I would highly encourage you to please fill out that survey before you go. I also want to put a quick call out for our 2026 symposium, which will be held in April, from April 22nd to the 24th, 2026. So please keep your eye open out for on our website, and hopefully you're signed up to some of our notices that get emailed quite regularly to let you know about upcoming events at CDA. So with that, I'll sign off and thank you everybody for participating in today's session.